The Mourning the Creation of Racial Categories project, or the MCRC project, partners with the creative and performing arts to tell the stories of how racial categories such as Asian, Black, and White were created. The MCRC project makes the case that the ways in which people came to be divided into racial categories is something to be mourned.
Swatches of skin matched to meaning, swaddled by a category.
This idea of race has been in our history for the past 400 years, yet we truly don't understand it.
Go, Archie, go! If not for your sake, go for mine!
Everyone is affected and everyone has something to mourn.
The MCRC project does not tell the entire story of race. MCRC uses the art to put the focus on how people were divided into what appears to be a neat checklist of categories.
We are all familiar with this checklist. Just think, we apply these 6 categories to the 332.4 million people who live in the US and the 7.9 billion people who live in the world. But the categories are not neat divisions of humanity. I understand that you have 2 grandchildren and that one has a Black classified father and the other a white classified one. Do you have any fears about how the racial category system might get in the way?
I don't want the world to separate the both of them, meaning the child who is fully African-American and the child who is, biracial. That's my fear. I just don't want to see separation. I want them to come together in unity and know that we're part of the same family and we're gonna love each other just the same and not being divided by the world.
My husband, category white, we had a child together, our first child, and we went over the normal birth plan and are we gonna breastfeed and are you gonna get an epidural? But it was when the birth certificate came into the room when I was at awe of what am I going to do? What category am I going to check? Being a biracial woman and my husband being white, things are going in my head. I'm doing fractions. I'm a half Black. He's full white. Is that that's a quarter Black? What do I do? And I checked category white because I felt that my children, now I have 2, but my child, when seen in public, would only look white. And the trauma for that for me as a biracial mother was that I gave up my category that day. And it was very emotional. And I could not describe that, not even to my husband. I couldn't explain it until you presented this project.
When I check a box, I check African American. Sometimes I find myself, I would just put Black though, just to kind of I don't really feel American all the time.
My mother's Filipino. My father has Irish and Native American in him. And so I think that it gets difficult to check a category.
We have 2 boys and 2 girls. The boys are the oldest, girls are the youngest, and they identify as African American. I guess, especially for my boys, I let them know as far as society is concerned, in their eyes, you're Black. You're African American in their eyes, so they identify like that. But we still let them know you are, you're Filipino, Caucasian, Irish, so you are those things. But as far as society is concerned, they're gonna view you as a Black man.
The 3 families in the film clip we just watched speak to what Carlos Fernandez terms the American identity crisis. Here is how he defines it. The separation of biologically related peoples into racial categories is at the heart of an unresolved American identity crisis and makes the resolution of the general race problem virtually impossible. In Let Our Loss Be Heard, the MCRC project tells the story of the Garner family, and in the process helps us to understand, to feel, and to mourn the American identity crisis.
About 10 o'clock on Sunday night, a party of 8 slaves belonging to Archibald K. Gaines and John Marshall of Richwood Station, Boone County, Kentucky, about 16 miles from Covington, escaped by horse and sleigh. 3 are Robert Garner, his mother Mary, and his father Simon. They are the property of Marshall. The other 5, the property of Gaines, are Robert's 21-year-old pregnant wife, Margaret, and her 4 children, Thomas, age 6, Samuel, age 4, Mary, age 2, and Scylla, 9 months. The news accounts describe Margaret as about 5 feet 3 inches in height, a mulatto showing from 1/4 to 1/3 white blood. The boys are bright-eyed and woolly-headed. The youngest boy is mulatto. Scylla, the 9-month-old, is light enough to show a red tinge in her cheeks. Mary was almost white and was a little girl of rare beauty. The 8 rode in the sleigh to the riverbank, where they walked over the frozen Ohio River into Cincinnati. Mr. Gaines, springing on a horse, followed in pursuit. After a few hours of diligent inquiry, Gaines learned that his slaves were in a house about 1/4 of a mile below the Mill Creek Bridge on River Road. On reaching the house, officers attempted to force the door open. A window was suddenly thrown up. Robert presented a pistol and fired 3 times, wounding 1 deputy. During the affray, Margaret had struck her infant Scylla on the head with a fire shovel with the intention of taking her life. She slashed at the 2 boys, giving one a 4-inch gash to his throat and the other a gash to his head. The 2-year-old lay on the floor dead with her throat slashed. Mr. Gaines, the master, picked up the dead child and was in the act of carrying her off when objections were made to the body being removed before an inquest was held. He at length surrendered the child. The mother of the dead child acknowledges she killed it, and that her determination was to have killed all the children and then destroy herself rather than return to slavery.
In this film clip, the art MCRC uses to tell the Garner story was made for a purpose, to replace this illustration by Thomas Noble, which appeared in Harper's Weekly in 1867. This is the image that accompanies almost every reference to the Garner story. Study Noble's illustration and take in what you see. Notice that Margaret's husband, Robert, is not by her side, yet newspaper reports tells us he was. Why are 2 Black appearing adult male bodies dead on the floor? Why is the Garner family depicted as only 1 shade of brown? Why do you think Noble misrepresented the story? And why have we accepted this image for the past 153 years? A second, lesser known, locally based image of the Garner family is this flood wall mural celebrating the Garner family crossing the Ohio River from Covington into Cincinnati. Notice that the family's skin complexion is 1 shade of brown. The image hides the complexity of the family's story. MCRC calls on artists, poets, composers, musicians, dancers, actors, visual artists to tell the Garner story in all of its complexity. And in this process, confront the American identity crisis. MCRC art acknowledges Margaret Garner's place in history as the mother of both Black and white appearing children. When we take in this story, it is clear that the Black and white appearing share a complicated and intertwined history, which includes a historical connection to Margaret Garner.
MCRC also tells this complicated story through sculpture. Here we see Robert and Margaret Garner. These sculptures help us feel their story, and by extension, to feel the American identity crisis. Here we see the entire family together. Let's hear about these sculptures from the artist who made them.
I was really affected by the Margaret Garner story. There's a very famous piece of art where Apollo is chasing Daphne, and he's trying to assault her, and Daphne is extending her limbs and turning into a tree in order to avoid being assaulted. So I felt that I would like to show this in my artwork by making the Garner family into trees. Ceramics for me is heavier. There's more weight to it. So when I want to work with something that's a little bit more, emotional for me, sometimes I work in ceramics. Just because there's like a physical weight to it. They all are a combination of how the trauma has affected each one of them. Like, you get your mother's trauma as a child. And even though Robert wasn't necessarily all of their biological parents, they had to watch him protect them, and he felt very strongly about their safety. So it's all very interconnected.
What is the origin of the American identity crisis? The origin of the American identity crisis can be traced to how our country addressed the two questions posed on this slide. How do we classify the offspring of enslavers and enslaved women? How do we classify the offspring of an enslaved woman and men other than the enslavers? The answer to this question lies with the condition of the mother law.
Condition of the mother laws. Enslaved women were subjected to the condition of the mother laws. One law of 1662 stated, "All children born in this country shall be held slave or free, depending on the condition of the mother." This law guaranteed a perpetual supply of bodies for free labor. Notice that the women's skin differs in shades. Also notice that some babies appear to be a different race than the mothers carrying them. Regardless if the mother was enslaved, her baby was enslaved. The fathers could not matter. The condition of the mother law disregarded the status of the biological father. The father could be enslaved, indentured, free, or the mother's own master. In other words, an enslaved woman's master owned any babies born to her. These laws tied the fate of a baby to the fate of its mother and were the engine driving intergenerational enslavement.
How does the condition of the mother law reveal itself in the lives of those affected by it? For insight on how the condition of the mother law impacted lives, let's take a brief detour from the Garner family story and consider the life of Harriet Jacobs, who wrote Incidents of the Life of a Slave Girl, published in 1861. In the book, Jacobs vividly describes the law's toxic effects. She writes that many of her family members, including her parents and her own children, had inherited the complexion of Anglo-Saxon ancestors. She addresses the American identity crisis in other passages. Who can measure the amount of Anglo-Saxon blood coursing in the veins of American slaves? My grandfather, on the paternal side, was a white gentleman What tangled schemes are the genealogies of slavery? The secrets of slavery are concealed like those of the Inquisition. My master was, to my knowledge, the father of 11 slaves.
I once saw two beautiful children playing together. One was a fair white child, the other was her slave, and also her sister. When I saw them embracing each other and heard their joyous laughter, I turned sadly away from the lovely sight. I foresaw the inevitable blight that would fall on the little slave's heart. I knew how soon her laughter would be changed to sighs. In cases where white women had a baby with an enslaved man, the infant is smothered or sent where it is never seen by anyone who knows its history.
Many a husband discovered that his wife had fled from slavery years ago. And as the child follows the condition of its mother, the children of his love were liable to be seized and carried into slavery. Everywhere in those humble homes, there was consternation and anguish. I once saw a young slave dying soon after the birth of a child nearly white. In her agony, she cried out, "Oh Lord, come and take me." Her mistress stood by and mocked her. "You suffer, do you?" she exclaimed. "I am glad of it. You deserve it all, and more too."
The young wife soon learns that the husband pays no regard to his marriage vows. Children of every shade of complexion play with her own fair babies. Linda vowed not to have a baby, and Linda is Harriet Jacobs. She goes by that name in the book. Linda vowed not to have a baby conceived out of rape by her enslaver. An unmarried white gentleman became interested in me. He expressed sympathy and a wish to aid me. I made a headlong plunge and had a child with this man, taking a chance he would find a way to buy us.
In the US, we have yet to confront our identity crisis. The MCRC project commissioned dancers and composers to help explore our identity crisis and the deep emotions underlying it, especially as it relates to the categories Black and white.
In the first dance scene, we meet Robert and Margaret Garner. We also meet one of Margaret's children, her 2-year-old daughter, Mary, a product of rape, who appears almost white. The likely father is Archibald Gaines, who owns both Margaret and his daughter. We learn from Margaret's anguish and desire to protect Mary, no matter the cost. The American identity crisis reveals itself on many levels. The child is the offspring of both Black and white classified biological parents, but inherits the condition of the mother, not her father. Archibald is the father of a child he owns. The law removes his responsibility as father to marry his biological child.
In scene 2, I Love You with All My Weight, we explore 2-year-old Mary's identity crisis that reveals itself in her complex relationship to Robert, who, while not her biological father, is her father figure. Mary, even at age 2, feels an inexplicable barrier that separates her from Robert. Robert's identity crisis is that he must find a way to be a father figure to a child born to his wife out of rape. The MCRC project turns to trauma therapists to help our country sort through the identity crisis and the implications of breaking apart families to make the categories work.
Robert's sadness and the weight of the situation that this family finds himself in is evident within his body. And it would only be natural for Mary to pick up on that.
Kids do pick up things that maybe parents don't necessarily want to teach their children. And then if they can't understand it, they have to come up with their own way of explaining it. And their way of explaining it could be not adaptive or not helpful, or it's hard to understand sometimes what our parents are telling us, although we can pick up there's something going on.
Mary just wants to be loved because she's a child, and that's what children want. But she probably would never get a narrative to help her understand that.
Right. Yeah.
And so that's the devastating part, I think, when I look at I Love You with All My Weight, that while that weight is in love, that weight is also stifling and it smothers not in the sense that he's overbearing her with love, but the weight of the situation prevents him from being able to actually connect with her. When I allow myself to remember that Mary was 2 years old and had no way of conceptualizing the world that was around her, I can understand Robert and loving her as a daughter, but realizing the complexities that lie before them as a family. But I think about Mary. She's a child. And at this time, from birth to 18 months, it's all about attaching to your primary caregivers. And that attachment, or lack thereof, really does form a huge foundation to how a person will go on and conceptualize the world and make further relationships.
When there is love and there's something that's preventing the love from being fully expressed, I think that's one of the saddest things in the world.
In scene 3, Were You There?, Archibald enters. The family's escape to freedom is interrupted. Robert fends off Archibald as Margaret springs into action to kill Mary. In the aftermath, we see Archibald and Robert grieve in very different ways. The scene ends with Robert and Margaret handcuffed and Archibald in possession of the dead child's body. The identity crisis is unbearable for all four: Margaret, Robert, 2-year-old Mary, and Archibald. Our nation has no words. The arts help us feel this identity crisis.
Were you there when she pierced the baby's neck? Were you there when she slashed the child's head? Oh, we made the children crumble, crumble, crumble. Were you there when she pierced the baby's neck? Were you there? Were you there? Were you there when she had to kill her child? Were you there when she did the best she could? Oh, we made the bodies tumble, tumble, tumble. Were you there when she had to kill her child? Were you there? Sometimes it causes me to tremble, tremble, We were there, and we lost the child. We were there. We were there, and we crucified the child. We were there.
Again, we turn to trauma therapists.
What kind of mother could slit her daughter's throat, right? When you've lived a life and you've experienced life that was far worse than any death you could imagine, death is not the ultimate bad, it's a freedom.
Right.
And when I think about how difficult it must have been to know that the only way you could protect your child was to cause them harm.
There's a quote by Rumi who says, "The wound is the place where the light enters." But this wound has been not allowed to heal, and so it's like infected scar tissue, and it's the good skin can't heal over it until we process that wound. And so as long as we're still perpetuating these categories, we are there. We were there the day that it happened to Mary.
We're still living this out today. We were there because we can understand it in today's context.
Yeah.
You might think that if only the Garner family had made it to freedom, they would have been safe together. But the way categories work, the family never had a chance to stay together. Listen to the poem, The Ohio River, written from the point of view of one of the Garner children as he crosses the frozen Ohio River with his family towards freedom. We learn about the child's fear for his family, but especially his fear that racial categories would tear his family, especially his siblings, from him. The video integrates poetry, theater, and visual art.
Healing from trauma begins with the telling of repressed stories.
The Ohio River. Our feet left the snow and slid onto a sheet of ice. I turned to retreat, but Mama clenched my arm. Her fingers indented my skin. She bent her womb-filled body to level with my eye, and with venom and a strand of desperation, she repeated, "Walk." The babies were swaddled, their faces pressed to breast. There their tears slipped and their cries were smothered. Sam held onto my hand and pressed every time the ice veined beneath us. My hand began to throb, but I didn't dare tell him to let go. Mama's ankle disappeared from the surface, and as she fell, her shrieks only subsided into ceaseless moans. They beat at the ice until her foot resurfaced. Through shivering shudders, I pleaded, "What are we walking for?" And with a tone just as brittle as the ice, Father looks through me and says, "For freedom, boy." Until I could feel him look away, I held my tongue in obedience and bowed my head in submission. Then I watched as those desperate bodies wearied across the ice. I pitied the color of them, the weight of them. I wondered, what were we going to do with freedom? Would freedom even look right on us? I pictured them in freedom. I pictured them on a sunny day in freedom. Youth restored, and the kids circling at their feet for sugary sweets. I saw them in freedom. And then I saw everyone watching them. Everyone else saw what I saw. I looked down at my brother's hand, wrapped so needlingly around mine. Would he be like this in freedom? Would he still need me in freedom? The kids used to joke that he wasn't really my brother, that Mary and Scylla weren't really my sisters. Would I lose them in freedom? I should have known that freedom was the ice giving out, giving us a way out. We just had to keep stomping on it is all. We should have fallen through. We should have fallen deep into freedom.
In this clip, the poet of the Ohio River poem, India Seda, shares her thoughts.
The Ohio River poem was from the perspective of one of the Garner's sons. And that poem was really supposed to highlight the perspective of a child who's not viewing freedom the way that society has gotten used to viewing freedom, which is something to be yearned for. And the only reason why he views it in such a negative way, and the line that's in the poem is this what freedom looks like, is because he sees that in this yearning for freedom, it literally, it led his family to disaster. And so he just thought that, well, maybe this wasn't worth it, and even if we had it, we still wouldn't fit in freedom because we're still separated by our racial appearances.
We turn to a historian, Dan Hurley, who explains the power of the MCRC project.
Well, I think that for most people, history is chronology. It's one thing right after another. And the sense is that if you put the things in order, that somehow you've told the story and you've created history. And that's really not what it's about at all. What it's really about is being able to see the world through somebody else's eyes in another place, in another time, and therefore you expand your world. And I think that's what this does. It is getting at not essentials of the story. It's not filled with words, but it is getting at the emotion and the sense of depth and identity that Margaret Garner, her husband, her children, the people around her, her owner, and how all of that was interacting. And I think that's what this gets at in a way that words on a page or an image can't do. It brings it all alive.
The American identity crisis goes beyond the condition of the mother law. For 400 years, we have followed these rules for classification. Any baby born to a classified parent and a white classified parent is considered Black. Any baby born to a Black classified parent and a parent classified as a race other than white is Black. These rules show one formula for how our country separated biologically related people.
We close this presentation by returning to the words of Carlos Fernandez. The separation of biologically related people into racial categories is at the heart of an unresolved American identity crisis and makes the resolution of the general race problem virtually impossible. Using the arts to tell historical and contemporary stories about families living this identity crisis tells us race is not biological. It is stranger than fiction.
The MCRC project sheds light on this unresolved identity crisis. We cannot heal racial divides if we do not know how we were divided.
Well, this is for the state right there. We have a few questions from the audience. So start with the first one is the impact. Could you speak to the impact of historical trauma on the American Black community in particular? The questioner poses. What would you say to those who say that what happened so long ago happened long ago? It's time to move on.
Well, basically what the MCRC tries to do is make us realize that, for one, even if it did happen long ago, we're still living them. Today is something that we still pass down generation to generation. So even if we can't articulate what it is and what we're feeling, we know that something is there. So until we, like I said in that last slide, until we kind of get to that point of healing, it will always kind of be this lingering thing. Even though it happened so long ago, it's still pretty present when we really think about it.
That's why we introduced the three people who began the project and the way the past is felt on their family relationships. So there's many other ways we could talk about it, but that was one way we could in terms of those three family stories that began the presentation today.
A lot of your presentation looks at the American experience, and one of our questioners wonders how this compares to the experience in other countries in the creation of racial categories in the world, particularly European countries. Is there a contrast or something unique about the American experience?
Well, that would be a whole long story, but two things come to my mind right now that are kind of simple answers, but also very impactful answers, I think. And I really learned these answers from students in my class. One student in particular, I remember she was from Brazil, and we read the book, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. And she came into class that day after we had read it, and she said, and I wish I had had it taped or something, she said, looking at me, not accusatory toward me, toward the United States, she said, you lied to us. You said you never mixed. And after reading Incidents, she knew that this was all hidden from the world. And she said, we thought in our country that we were inferior because we mixed. And she goes, that's how powerful the American vision of race was, that our country tried to get away from declaring themselves or identifying with Black. And if you know anything about Brazil, one of the things is that they look at everybody as multiracial, that they recognize we all mix. We don't do that so much. We don't do that at all in the United States. Recognize that we're all multiracial, no matter our appearances. So that's a way to kind of tell a lot in a little story. And I just got a essay the other day from a student in my class from the, I won't reveal the name of the country because I don't want to reveal his identity, but he said, I am Margaret Garner, and he's very dark complexioned. And he said, I am not 164th, 128th, one whatever. He goes, I am the blackest of Black. And he goes, I am living the story of Margaret Garner. And there's so much to what he wrote in that piece, but I understood from his writing, I had not seen it expressed quite like that before, that the United States color line and his position on it was traumatizing to him in the United States. And he asked, one of his questions was, why do we use these words? Why do we describe people like this? So I think it's another example of the trauma of racial categories and the power of the United States to present its vision of race to the world. Maybe you can add to that. You can add to that too.
Well, the next question, I really think about it in two parts. the audience is interested in the art component of this and the creative process of the students who participated. So if you could, I'm going to ask you a specific question, if you could do that one first, but then maybe move into what it's been like to witness this creative process and what it draws out and why the arts are important in telling this story. But the specific question is wondering the hymn, the use of the hymn as the basis for the song that was used with the dance. Do you know why the author of that music, the lyrics, picked that hymn? What's the thought process there?
Well, I'm going to answer that, but I went because it's such a cute story. I went to church with Lanisa while we were doing Let Our Loss Be Heard. And I'm sitting there, listening to music, and I thought, this movie, Let Our Loss Be Heard, it has to contain Negro spirituals. And so, because I'm listening to the music in the church, so as soon as the service was over, I went home and I looked down all the spirituals, and I saw two that we used in the movie, Walk Together Children, and Were You There? And from there, we approached a poet, Kelly Moffitt, and asked her, can you turn Were You There into music that corresponds with the Garner story? And she did. And Jason Vest, who you can see is a world-class tenor, sang it. And as you can see, the dancers are from the community and also from NKU. I don't use the word student artists because right away, for some reason, their status lowers. So you won't hear me say that, student artists. But the artists that we then enacted it in art, in dance, in sculpture, in add to the joy of all this, will you, for me?
Yes, we use a lot of different artists, as she was mentioning. We also use music as a form of art, and all of it is purposely put together to tell this story in a way that we feel that words just don't adequately express. And we also use the arts as a way to evoke emotions. A lot of times when we hear things, it goes in one ear and out the other. But when we see them visually or we hear them and we get all of our other senses working together, we feel it in a different way than if we were to just hear words being said to us. So the arts are very essential when it comes to MCRC and evoking that emotions of race that most of the time we really can't say or, really express what it is that we're feeling. But we do like that we're feeling something. As long as we can get that feeling out of people, then we can start to have a conversation about how these categories were formed and the traumas that we feel as a result of the racial categories.
Two people ask a version of the same question, and on this, I think this was a line that you used toward the end of the presentation. For 400 years, we have used these categories and followed these rules. And so the question in both instances is really about, is there a time when we won't? So as one person put it, we don't seem to be moving away from categories, we seem to be moving toward more categories. So how do you see this playing out over the next 20 years? And the way the other person phrased the question is, how do we free ourselves of racial categories?
So how do we, where do I see it going in 20 years? I think the categories will still be here in 20 years. And one of the things that we emphasize in MCRC is trying to articulate and inform people just how the categories were created in the first place. And I think that that is the first step, is realizing that these categories were put into place. It was very deliberate. Laws were created to make them appear as something that's real. Families were divided to classify people into these 5 to 6 categories. And until we can really get to how they were created and why they were created, they'll probably still be here. We get this question a lot where people will just say, let's just get rid of the categories. It's easy to say that, not so easy to do. So when we think about that last statement, it's been around for 400 years. It's not going to go away in 20 or in 5 or in 10. It's going to take some time for us to get past these racial categories, but we can't just get rid of them without really digging into how they were created in the first place. Because even if we got rid of the categories tomorrow, we'll still feel the effects of race. We'll still be living with those traumas. Race will still matter. We just don't check a box anymore. So we have to get to the root of why these categories are here in the first place so that we can get to that place of healing. And hopefully one day the categories won't matter. And that's, you know, the goal, but how that will process, you know, I think we just need to take it one step at a time and really deal with these traumas of what these racial categories have done to each and every one of us, because all of us live our race every single day.
Yep, and everybody has a relationship with race,
Mhm.
even if it is a relationship that says, I don't want it to exist. Why does it matter? That's a relationship with race. So I think that our project, it's going to play a small part in changing the world, I think, in the sense that we do need to mourn this story. And until our country does see it as a sad, I don't want to call it a sad story, a story worthy of mourning, then we're not going to move away from racial categories, because it won't happen until we acknowledge what they are and how they were made. And of course, tonight, we've only touched the surface on the kind of things we cover for how the racial categories were created.
That's, I think, a good segue for my next question is, how do audiences consume this project? So it's nice to have you here with us this evening for an hour or so, but they're films, they're pieces of art. So people want to consume more of this, stay up with the Mourning project. Just give us a little information on that.
Yeah, well, the MCR, you can just go to the mcrcproject.org, and we have a really nice visual art show which covers 7 key questions about race. For example, how did we divide people into black and white? How did black become the contaminating category and white the pure? How did white become free and black enslaved? So there's 7 of these done through the arts and kind of give a little history lesson. So that is a way, you know, to keep up with us. I try to keep the website up, but sometimes we get behind on it. And you can always contact us too, and we're happy to talk, you know, to anybody. When you ask about how audiences receive this, well, we both use it in class, and we know several of our colleagues use it. We present probably 10 or 12 talks a year at least. And I can say that in our presentations, I would say the universal, we never get defensiveness or anger, or not that there shouldn't be, but for something about this puts people in a state of sorrow. And that happens about everywhere that we talk. And I think sorrow is an important component to healing.
If I could follow up on that, I know we have some primary and secondary educators in our audience tonight. And could you speak to the how this might be used in the classroom? February next week, we'll start Black History Month, and a lot of our schools will try to talk about the topics appropriate to the month. Are there components of this project that P12 educators could use?
Well, we're actually creating a curriculum based on some of the stories from the MCRC, well, that the MCRC tells, I'll say that. And hopefully it would be pretty universal, so it's not something that's too complex, because what we do know is that kids pick up on race very quickly, especially like that, you know, pre-K, you know, K through 12 age. You start to pick up on things, you start to sense things. You start to notice people's skin complexions or people being treated differently based on skin complexions and things like that. So one of the stories that we didn't talk about today, but is pretty key to MCRC, is the story of Archie and Thomas, who were friends and had to separate. It's really complex, but their skin complexion had a lot to do with one getting freedom and then one being enslaved for life. And what we tell our students to think about is stories that they can relate to. When has there been a time where race has shown up in your family, or when has race gotten in the way of your friendships? And that has been a really effective way to really explain how racial categories were formed and how we were separated, how friendships were separated, how family members were separated. So MCRC really does translate well in the classroom, and just using little small stories like that really helps teach how race was created and just show just how much it is a social construct that changes over time, and our relationships are affected by it as well.
So those questions have to do with the external value of the project, but there's an internal value also as NKU students engage around this material and across disciplines. Could you talk about that aspect of it as college professors? What value have you seen that this project brings to the college classroom?
You know, well, I use it and I can't teach race any other way than this model that MCRC presents. And I wish I had, you know, it's almost like it's wordless, because look at the young people who took sociological ideas and made you feel them, and made us understand. We say race is a construction all the time. Well, if I ask somebody, what does that mean, race is a construction? That's about all they can say. I know it's a construction. Okay, well, what is it? How do you construct it? And I think the student art, and again, I'm using student here because I was asked to, but the artists have the skills that are so high, and they bring life to this story. And I wish, you know, here I am, 66 years old, and I wish I could have thought of the project 40 years ago. You know, it's been the last 6 years of my life that I've been able to see the power of collaboration and partnership and caring, and the desire of students to make these ideas come alive, and faculty colleagues as well. So I don't know if I'm answering that question, but it's a very emotional and rewarding experience to be part of this project. And we could talk about social ideas all the time, but when you put this with it, people remember things about race that just us talking about it sociologically, you know, might happen, but not as likely.
And I'll just add one thing to that. Our students find a way to articulate things that are just so amazing. We learn a lot from our students just by like the essays they might write about race, or what they learn from MCRC, how they could, you know, translate it into conversations that they now have with their family and friends. And we just learn so much from, you know, just how they really grasp the information, and just the type of emotions that it evokes for them is a learning process for us as well. We get to see a lot of patterns with even just the different racial categories of our students that we wouldn't have known otherwise had we not presented this material to them the way that the MCRC presents the material.
Yeah, and we're starting a new project called the Strange Meaning of Being Project. And it takes from Du Bois' Strange Meaning of Being Black, but we're borrowing his phrase for strange meaning of being Asian, strange meaning of being Black, strange meaning of being Hispanic. And we're making a little film about each of it. And just recruiting students for this and seeing the words are just so fresh. I think that's what it is. That the words and the ideas, you know, when the ideas hit someone for the first time, that's the most joy for me to hear it come out. You know, the ideas have been in my head for forever, and they don't sound as fresh. And it's just, if anybody in the audience knows what I'm talking about, I get to live this, and we get to live this every time we meet with our artists, to just feel race fresh. And it must matter to them. You know, you kind of say race shouldn't matter anymore. It sure matters to our artists. And they're able to articulate it quite well.
One final question. We're on the eve of this anniversary of the really remarkable story of the Garner family, risking it all for freedom to cross cross into Ohio and with the hope of freedom, even though that's not what was delivered. You've now been connected deeply with this story for the past 6 or so years. I'm wondering if there are dimensions of it that have been illuminated to you through this project that you might not have expected when you started.
I think the deepest thing is talking to people of different racial classifications and learning the perspectives of people beyond, I prepare, I suppose everybody would think is white, classified. And I'm a little more complex than that, but this is my appearance. And I have a lens that is shaped by my appearance in this society. So for me, it is talking just what is gained by learning about Margaret Garner from various lenses in the society. And it might be a complexion lens, or it could be a white or black lens, but it could also be an Asian classified lens or a Hispanic classified lens. That's when it really opens up that story, and that it resonates with, no matter the racial classification, it resonates with everybody. So there are too many things, really, too many little things to talk about, like even the dance scenes, like how we worked it out and how we talked about it, and how does Robert allow Archibald to take possession of the body? And of course, he doesn't have, it's also the law gives Archibald the body, but how does he handle himself as Archibald goes toward? And when you look at the newspaper articles, Robert was supportive of Margaret, and you could see him holding back Archibald, and we honored that. What we know from newspapers, however flawed they are, it seemed to appear that he supported this, and they might have even thought it through together. If this happens, this is what we're going to do. And so we tried to honor that in the dance scenes, and then to get the dancers thinking about how to do it, and how does Robert position himself to Archibald. All those things are good for the imagination to think through that past and really feel it. And I think that's a value that comes with this project. Like Dan Hurley said, that's the purpose of history. And the purpose of MCRC is that we can experience what has caused our national identity crisis.
Yeah, I think what illuminates for me when it comes to the Garner family story is definitely putting the dance together and just seeing how the artist feels the story. It feels it on a very personal level, because when we think about it, the Garner family story, even though it seems like an isolated event, is really a universal story. If all of us go back in our histories, there will probably be something not necessarily as similar to that, but something that we can pick up on where we were divided some way, somehow, from family members. So it's really a universal story that people gravitate toward. And that's what really illuminates for me, is just how you can feel it on such a personal level. And I think the dance does that in a very effective way, especially.
And if there's anybody out there that can help us, we need a Margaret Garner representation. If it's a sculpture, something to replace the noble image that is everywhere. Mm-hmm. And this flood wall image. I mean, it's good that it's there, but an image that shows their complexity would go a long way to understanding our identity crisis as a nation.
Well, Joan, Melissa, if you'll just stay where you are for just a moment, I want to remind the audience that our next 6 at 6 is February the 22nd, Democracy in the Arts, How to Be a Person Who Stands. Tracy Bonner, who's an associate professor of dance at NKU, will be delivering a lecture along with some of her students who will dance as she speaks, and will be in the auditorium at the Museum Center in partnership with the Nancy and David Wolf Holocaust and Humanities Center at the Museum Center. And so I want to thank the audience for joining us this evening. And if you would all just, I know you're at home and we can't hear you, but applause to Joan and Lanissa.
Thank you. Thank you.
You can walk away.